The planet Xerxes was not a place where stories ended well. It was a dust bowl on the outer rim of a forgotten system, a world so inconsequential that even the intergalactic cartographers had stopped updating its coordinates. For the miners who worked its surface, Xerxes was simply the last stop, the place you came when every other door in the galaxy had been slammed in your face. Coren Vance knew this better than most. He had been on Xerxes for 3 standard years, which was 2 years and 11 months too long. His body had adapted to the thin, chalky air and the constant, low-grade tremors that shook the planet's crust. His soul, however, had not. Every morning, he woke in his prefab habitat unit, pulled on his filtration mask, and walked 5 kilometers to the dig site. Every evening, he walked back, ate a nutrition bar that tasted of cardboard and regret, and stared at the single photograph taped to his wall, a picture of a green world with blue oceans, a world he would never see again. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight was his last night. The company had finally declared the northern vein depleted. The operation was shutting down. A transport ship was scheduled to arrive at dawn to collect the remaining workers and take them to the nearest hub world, where they would be scattered across the galaxy like seeds on the wind. Coren had nowhere to go, no credits saved, and no prospects waiting. But he had one thing left, one final ration pack. It was not a special ration pack. It was the same synthetic, nutrient-dense block of protein and carbohydrates that had sustained him for 3 years. But it was his. And tonight, he decided he would not eat it alone in his barren habitation unit. He would eat it outside, under the bruised purple sky of Xerxes, and he would pretend it was a feast. He found a flat rock near the edge of the settlement, a place where the constant wind had carved strange, flowing patterns into the stone. He sat down, cracked open the sterile packaging, and looked at the meal inside. It was a brown, rectangular slab, unremarkable in every way. But to Coren, it was a symbol. It was the last thing he controlled in a life that had been controlled by others for as long as he could remember. He was about to take his first bite when he sensed movement behind him. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. She stood perhaps 10 meters away, silhouetted against the faint glow of the settlement's perimeter lights. She was tall, impossibly tall, with a posture that spoke of absolute authority. Her clothing was unlike anything Coren had ever seen on Xerxes. It was not the practical, worn gear of a miner or the utilitarian jumpsuits of the company administrators. It was a flowing garment of deep violet and silver, threaded with patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer in the low light. Her face was angular, elegant, and marked by 2 thin lines of silver that ran from her temples to her jaw. Whether tattoos, scars, or something else, Coren could not tell. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of old gold, and they burned with an intensity that made the freezing wind feel like a warm breeze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled across the plain, kicking up clouds of fine red dust. Coren's first instinct was fear. Strangers on Xerxes were rarely a good sign. They were usually debt collectors, company enforcers, or desperate fugitives. But there was something about this woman that defied those categories. She did not look desperate. She did not look like she belonged anywhere near this wretched world. "Are you lost?" Coren asked, his voice muffled by his filtration mask. It was a stupid question, but it was the only one that came to mind. The woman took a step closer. Her movement was fluid, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the universe. She did not respond to his question. Instead, her gaze dropped to the ration pack in his hands. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice was deep, melodic, and carried an accent Coren could not place. It was as if she were speaking his language perfectly, but from a great distance. Coren looked down at the brown slab. "It's dinner," he said. "My last one, actually. They're shutting down the mine. Transport comes tomorrow." The woman's golden eyes flickered with something, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. She took another step closer, then another, until she stood directly before him. Up close, she was even more striking. Her skin was flawless, pale as moonlight, and the silver lines on her face seemed to pulse faintly as if alive. "May I sit?" she asked. It was such an ordinary request, spoken with such formal grace, that Coren almost laughed. Instead, he nodded and gestured to the rock beside him. She sat, her violet and silver garments pooling around her like liquid shadow. For a moment, they simply sat together in silence, two figures on a barren world, watching the wind carve its invisible patterns into the stone. Coren looked at the ration pack in his hands. It was small, barely enough for one person. But something about this stranger's presence made the idea of eating alone feel wrong. Without overthinking it, he broke the slab in two and held out half to her. "Here," he said. "It's not much. It's actually pretty terrible. But it's all I have." The woman stared at the offered half as if it were the most precious object in the galaxy. Slowly, her long, slender fingers reached out and took it from his hand. Their fingers brushed, and Coren felt a jolt, not of electricity, but of something deeper, something that resonated in his chest. She examined the synthetic block with an expression of profound wonder. Then, to Coren's astonishment, she removed the hood of her garment, revealing a cascade of silver-white hair that seemed to glow in the dim light. She raised the food to her lips and took a small, delicate bite. For a long moment she was still. Then her golden eyes widened, and she looked at Coren with an expression he could not read. "It is terrible," she agreed. And then, for the first time, she smiled. It transformed her face. The regal, distant mask fell away, and beneath it was something warm, human, and achingly vulnerable. Coren found himself smiling back, and in that moment, the freezing wind and the dying world and the crushing weight of his failures all seemed to fade into the background. They ate in companionable silence, passing the small ration pack back and forth until it was gone. When they finished, the woman turned to him, her golden eyes searching his face. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Coren shook his head. "Should I?" She looked away, out across the dark plain. "My name is Seraphine Valtorin. I am the Empress of 1,000 worlds, sovereign of the Valtorin dominion, ruler of every star within the Cygnus reach and beyond." Coren stared at her. The words were so absurd, so utterly out of place on this forgotten dust ball, that his first instinct was to laugh. But something in her voice, in the quiet weight of her confession, stopped him. "The Empress," he repeated slowly. "On Xerxes." "Yes." "Why?" She was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer, more human than he had heard it yet. "Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be anonymous. To be a person, not a title. For one night, I wanted to sit on a rock and share a meal with a stranger who didn't bow, who didn't kneel, who didn't look at me and see 1,000 worlds." Coren absorbed this. He thought about the photograph on his wall, the green world with blue oceans he would never see again. He thought about the years of solitude, the crushing weight of insignificance. And he thought about this woman, this Empress, who had everything and nothing, who had crossed the galaxy to sit on a barren rock and share a terrible meal with a failed miner. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "That you had to come all this way to find someone who didn't know who you were." The Empress studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched the silver lines on her face. They pulsed brighter for an instant, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a resonance that Coren felt in his bones. "Coren Vance," she said, "I have seen your file. I know your story. I know about the colony you lost, the family you couldn't save, the debts you've carried. I know why you're here. Coren's blood ran cold. How? I am the Empress, she said simply. I know many things. She stood, and as she did, the wind seemed to die around her. The silver lines on her face blazed with light, and for the first time, Coren saw the ship, a massive, silent shape descending through the purple sky, blotting out the stars. It was like nothing he had ever seen, a vessel of impossible elegance, its hull gleaming with the same violet and silver as her garments. The Empress turned to him, her golden eyes glowing in the light of her ship. You shared your last meal with me, she said. You gave me half of all you had, without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return. In all my 1,000 worlds, in all my years of rule, no one has ever done that. She extended her hand to him. Come with me, Coren Vance. Leave this world behind. I have 1,000 worlds, and I will give you one of them. Not as a subject, but as a friend. The only friend an empress has ever had. Coren stared at her hand. It was an impossible offer, a dream so absurd it could only be real. He thought about the transport ship coming at dawn, the uncertain future, the years of loneliness. And he thought about this woman, this empress, who had crossed the galaxy to sit on a rock and eat a terrible meal with a stranger. He took her hand. As they walked toward the ship, its light washing over them, Coren glanced back at the barren plain of Xerxes. The wind was already erasing their footprints, smoothing the rock where they had sat. In a few hours, the settlement would wake, and no one would remember the failed miner who had eaten his last meal alone. But Coren would remember. He would remember the night he shared his last meal with a stranger, and that stranger turned out to be the Empress of 1,000 worlds. He would remember the look in her golden eyes when she took that first bite of synthetic protein, the way she smiled, the warmth of her hand in his. And as the ship lifted off, carrying them away from the dust and the wind and the years of solitude, Coren realized that his last meal had not been an ending at all. It had been a beginning. The first meal of a new life, shared with someone who had finally seen him, not as a failure, not as a number, but as a person worth knowing. The Empress stood beside him, her silver-white hair floating in the ship's artificial gravity, her golden eyes fixed on the stars ahead. Thank you, she said quietly, so quietly that only he could hear. And Coren, the failed miner from a forgotten world, smiled and squeezed her hand. You're welcome, he said. But next time, dinner's on you.